be a Swiss Army knife, and she's a Swiss Army knife times 10. Thank you all for here today. And, the Times of London during the American Civil War, they would report on what was happening in the war. But it was crazy what they saw, these lurid tales of what was going on in America at the time. They couldn't believe that it was true, but they still felt they had to publish the stories on the chance that it was. The old copies of the London Times, you'll see that they're all under the banner, important if true. So it is with my... What is probably most significant in my bio, though, is the fact that growing up in Milwaukee, about as far away from the ocean as you can get as a kid, I was mesmerized by the undersea world thanks to Jacques Cousteau and thanks to Sea Hunt, an old black and white television series. Some of you may be old enough to remember Lloyd Bridges. Character's name was Mike Nelson. He would work every day in a wetsuit with no visible means of support, and that's who I wanted to be. And
I'm sorry, I don't know why.
We're going to try a different mic. In 1993, I started Santa Monica Baykeeper, and one of our projects was to plant kelp off Rocky Point and off Palos Verdes to restore kelp, and as you actually heard, to remove urchins and to try to restore the kelp beds. And one day I was taking off my wetsuit on the boat, and I realized, I'm Mike Nelson. I go to work every day in a wetsuit. I work for a nonprofit, which means I have no visible means of support. So fast forward to today, we now have the privilege of working with some of the most amazing scientists in the world who are finding out that indeed, as you heard and as you can see from this beautiful mural, that kelp and other seaweeds are providing food and fuel and pharmaceuticals and colorants and all kinds of industrial materials that the ocean can provide if we just protect the ocean. And that's why I'm so excited to be part of the AltaSea family. And that family starts with our amazing team, Jenny Crusoe, who you've already heard from or seen, but give her another round of applause. The real visionary here, the heart and soul. But let me ask all the rest of the AltaSea team to just stand up for a moment so everybody can see the rest of our team. Come on your feet. Thank you all so much. Yep, right over there. No, we know, but staff first. And then the chair of our board of directors, our board of trustees, Geraldine Natz. Geraldine, if you would say hello. And I saw Cynthia Hirschhorn somewhere. Is she still here, or did she go back to painting? Where's Cynthia? There she is, over there. Okay, one of our trustees, Cynthia Hirschhorn. And thank you all so much for being here. I'm not going to spend any more time up here gabbing. We'll all socialize later and chat about whatever you want to chat about. We're here today to talk about hydrogen. And we have one of the foremost authorities on the subject of hydrogen, particularly in transportation, Brian Goldstein of Energy Independence Now. You're starting to hear a lot about hydrogen, and particularly since the Department of Energy announced $10 billion that they want to pump into $2 billion hydrogen hub initiatives in various parts of the country, and we think California is very much in line to get one of those $2 billion awards to be demonstrating hydrogen, particularly in things like the marine environment, in transportation of goods, shipping, trucks, et cetera, et cetera. But it's going to be one of those things that will seem like an overnight discovery after 30 years of hard work. And that's Brian's story, because he's been working on this for how many years, Brian? Yeah, pretty close to that, yeah. And Energy Independence Now was started 20 years ago as a nonprofit to try to help the state develop the stations, the fueling stations, the clean fuel, so that we're not just making hydrogen from dirty sources, but so that it's actually made from sustainable sources, and that we're going to be using hydrogen in vehicles and in storing energy, especially intermittent wind and solar, not just in batteries, but in things like hydrogen. So to tell you the whole story and to answer all of your questions, every question you can possibly think of, you cannot stump Brian Goldstein. Give him a great big round of applause. Come on up here.
Thanks, Terry. Thanks, Terry. Well, that's definitely a hard act to follow because as the number one person here who's capable of saving the planet, Terry has really accomplished a lot. So let's definitely give Terry a round of applause. Well, we've got our work cut out for us, and I think that's actually where I'm gonna start, just with a little quib. So I'm gonna try to spare you all the PowerPoint. You know, we've got a couple of slides that we'll lean back on, but this was the main one just because I like the cow so much, and now I'm thinking we've got to get this cow some kelp. So hopefully there's somebody here that can help with that. But you know, per Terry's comments about, you know, we're not doing a very good job of it. I met somebody new last night who was introduced by a colleague, and my colleague wasn't there, and it was just kind of a new introduction. And the guy said, "Hey, your colleague told me about the work that you and your team are doing." And he said, I'm always fascinated by the environmental community because I think that you're doing God's work, right? And immediately I thought of this conversation I had with my wise older sister some years ago. I was really frustrated about something. I don't even remember what it was. And I said, well, you know, maybe I should just go out in the street and shake my fist at the sky and yell, "Why?" And she said, you know, you're probably not going to hear anything back, right? But in the unlikely case that you hear something back, it's probably going to sound a lot like, "It's your own damn fault," right? So what we're working on here is our own fault, and it's up to us to fix it. And there's nobody that has led that movement, taken responsibility for that, and led the charge up that hill more than Terry Tamminen. So it's really been a pleasure to work with him over the years, and truly an inspiration to work with Terry. So along those lines, what he didn't mention when he was talking about EIN is Terry actually founded EIN a little over 20 years ago. So at first it was a movement out of Environment Now, if that's right. I guess in the late 90s, early 2000. We received our own C3 status in about 2003. So going back 20 years or so, you know, EIN was founded just to focus on hydrogen and to help catalyze the early market for hydrogen. So initially that was done through the lens of transportation and light duty transportation. So EIN came in to, was that me? No? All right. Okay, all right, great. So EIN came in to help develop the early blueprint for the California Hydrogen Highway Initiative. And in doing so, we conducted analysis about how many hydrogen stations it would take to then be able to enable movement around the state to help, you know, catalyze the early market so that the OEMs could feel comfortable bringing in fuel cell electric vehicles that consumers could rely on to move around the state. At the end of the day, none of this technology is new. Hydrogen production technology is extremely mature. It's been around well over 100 years. Fuel cells and these modes of transportation aren't new. We've relied on them for the space program. We've relied on electrolysis, you know, since the 50s to keep people alive in, you know, spaceships and in submarines. What we needed to do was crack the chicken and the egg conundrum of what comes first, the station or the vehicles. And it was Terry that really had the foresight to say, hey, let's make a pact with OEMs. Let's get the government to come in and do, you know, what the government should really do is just kind of give the early market a push so it can stand up on its own. So in doing so, Terry and EIN together worked on legislation to help fund the first 100 hydrogen stations in the state of California. That was about 10 years ago. The state allocated about $200 million for that funding. We have about 54 of those stations open right now. Thankfully, the next governor that came in after Governor Schwarzenegger, Governor Brown, doubled that commitment to get us up to 200 stations. So ultimately, we're looking to get a critical mass of about 1,000 stations to help facilitate the market for light-duty fuel cell electric vehicles. And I'm here to talk a little bit about that, to kind of give an intro to hydrogen, why hydrogen, where it comes from, how we're going to use it, and then I'd love to really be able to engage the audience and help answer some questions because for almost 20 years I've been the crazy hydrogen guy in the room, like yelling at everybody, hey, you need to listen to us talk about hydrogen, and now all of a sudden it's having its moment. And so I feel like it's more in conversation and mainstream conversation than it ever has been. So I'm hoping that you all have some good questions to try to stump me here. So With that said, why hydrogen? Very simply put, it is the most abundant element in the universe. It is an excellent and very versatile energy carrier. And I always love to come back to Terry's Swiss Army knife analogies, because hydrogen truly is the Swiss Army knife of the new energy economy. It really is the most flexible storage medium that we could possibly ask for to be able to move energy from point A to point B, whether that's in the context of renewable energy storage or industrial decarbonization or transportation. Hydrogen is extremely versatile, and we're going to get into some of the applications there. So the overview of the hydrogen supply chain, what I'd really like to talk about here is the fact that we produce a lot of hydrogen as a state, as a country, the global industrial economy produces an enormous amount of hydrogen already. Even though it's all around us, it's the most abundant element on Earth, it doesn't really exist on its own. So we have to isolate it, and by sending it on its own to be used in these industrial applications. So there are various means of doing that. Typically that's been done with fossil fuels, right? We've pulled it out of methane. There are CO2 emissions, and that's been done primarily for oil refining and ammonia production outside of California. Within California, it's been mainly oil refining. But ammonia, which if you can imagine how much fertilizer we use all around the world, the primary component of that is hydrogen. And then there's an enormous case for hydrogen use in oil refining to scrub some of the dirtier elements out of crude oil to make gasoline and diesel. So to put that into context, we have produced over again, nearly 100 years here in California, about 2 million kilograms per day of hydrogen, primarily for oil refining. So I want you to remember that number, 2 million kilograms of hydrogen that we produce statewide, primarily that go to the refineries, many of them that are within 5 miles of this piece of property here. And we'll come back to that in just a couple of minutes. So one thing I'd like to say about the distribution of hydrogen is that's really one of the choke points, is how do we get hydrogen from point A to point B? The easiest way to do that is through a pipeline, because we don't have to compress it and store it in various containers and then put it in trucks or ships and then move it from point A to point B. So we are very lucky to be in an area with the only hydrogen pipeline in the state of California surrounding the port, and it's up until now been here to feed the refineries around, right around the port complex. But we've got some plans of what to do with that pipeline. So I mentioned that the primary means of production is through steam methane reform. Again, this is really just using fossil feedstocks to produce hydrogen for industrial purposes. But it's our vision that this will become entirely renewable, and it will become renewable through a variety of production means. This is, again, not new technology. There are plenty of ways that we can produce and distribute renewable hydrogen. And so combined with Terry and EIN's work, EIN co-authored legislation in 2006 saying that this has to be our end goal. And originally we were shooting for 100% because with Terry's DNA and EIN, we're going for the gold there. There are no small goals in the work that we do. But we had to bring that down a little bit at the time to 33.3% renewable standard for hydrogen sold in transportation. But the interesting part about that is that was in 2006. That was 9 years before a consumer could walk into a car dealership and drive a fuel cell electric vehicle off the lot. So EIN has been ahead of its time in many ways over many years, and right now we're really focused on how to completely decarbonize and provide renewable hydrogen well beyond the light-duty transportation sector. So let's move into that a little bit. I'd say the renewable hydrogen production method that most people have heard about is something called electrolysis, which is essentially using electricity to split water into hydrogen and oxygen into its two components of H2O. And if you use wind or solar to do that, it has zero carbon emissions, it has zero carbon intensity, right? So we envision a future where you can take excess electricity off of the grid. We're already curtailing enormous amounts in California, and we only have a 34% renewable mix here in the state right now. We're curtailing, almost 2 gigawatts a year. So there's this opportunity to take all of this excess energy that we're producing during the day when people don't have, their heating systems on at home and all of that stuff. We have this excess of energy during the day. So we envision being able to take that excess energy and split water and really use renewable hydrogen in that capacity. And I think that there are some really interesting opportunities to start exploring how we can do that with seawater and with wastewater. And this is where we start to introduce kind of where EIN's work overlaps with AltaSea's work. And I'm really particularly excited about that right now, because that moment where the hydrogen economy meets the blue economy, this is it. And we're about to jump into that a little bit. So, again, I just kind of wanted to go through a couple of the different production methods. These are just some stats about some of the progress over the last 2 years in the hydrogen movement. So, I wanted to mention, as we were talking about production methods, there are some other methods around hydrogen production that can use biogas, which methane from dairy farms or methane from wastewater treatment facilities. Those production means actually, by mitigating those methane emissions into the environment, even though we're using a gas feedstock for hydrogen, actually have a negative carbon intensity, which is actually lower than using wind or solar, for example, for electrolysis. So, I think at the end of the day, we'll be looking at electrolysis to be the primary, probably, production method over the next 20 or 30 years. But there are some really interesting production methods that we can use right now to have an impact in the early days of, well, I say the early days, overnight success after 20 years, as Terry mentioned. But there's some low-hanging fruit that we can really accomplish by using biogas right now. There's some other exciting technologies like pyrolysis, which are just now kind of coming to market. So we're excited to explore some of those projects as well. So this is really, and you have to excuse the double decarbonization. These are really the end-use applications that I mentioned before. So I've talked a little bit about transportation, and that's going to be my primary focus today. But I think perhaps the largest long-term application for renewable hydrogen is as a storage medium for renewable energy, right? And so the best way for me to break that down is to talk about our SB 100 goal, which is the goal that the state of California has made, which is law now, that we will move to 100% renewable electricity over the next 100 years or so, over the next 20 years or so. So if you imagine doing that primarily through wind and solar, we've got to consider that these are intermittent renewable sources, right? We're only producing solar maybe 8 hours a day. We've got to produce enough electricity, enough renewable electricity to keep a town the size of LA, to keep the lights on here overnight, right? So we've got to overproduce maybe by a factor, 3 times more electricity during that 8-hour window, so that when, the sun isn't shining or when we have a week of bad weather, which actually happens in other places, but not so much here, that we can store this electricity and then return it to the grid when necessary. And at the end of the day, there are a few ways of doing that. We can do it with batteries, but not at the scale that we would need to keep LA, or much less just the port complex, to keep the lights on here overnight. There's literally not enough lithium or cobalt in the world for all of us to go 100% renewable and use batteries to store that energy and return it to the grid. Even if there were, the dynamics of batteries are such that storage is really at its prime for about 4 to 8 hours, and then batteries kind of start to degrade. The amount of energy in the batteries starts to decline. So anyone who's left a car parked, for a month or so and then come back and the battery's dead, it's because the batteries can't just store the energy indefinitely without, being topped off or still being hooked in, to the grid to charge. Another really efficient method is pumped hydro, but we are certainly in an environment where water scarcity is really a source. We're not building new hydroelectric assets in California, or really much in the United States. It's actually a very efficient means, but again, the scale, if you can imagine, the fifth largest economy in the world, trying to keep that afloat, with pumped hydro, we just don't have that. And at the end of the day, we do have that opportunity. We have that scalability with hydrogen. So hydrogen at the end of the day is really the ultimate energy storage medium. And then we can take that energy and we can use it for transportation. We can use it to keep the lights on. We can use it to store excess energy that we produce in May and return it back to the grid and, in the middle of the summer when everyone's turning on their AC and we have these heat waves. So I'm really excited about that. I think over the long term, that is the most scalable use for hydrogen. But it's not the use that has the highest immediate impact in terms of air quality improvements and greenhouse gas reduction. That's all mobile source. So that's, the heaviest polluters in our economy. It's really the transportation sector, producing the fuel that supports the transportation sector, so producing gas and diesel, and it's really the trucks and heavy-duty equipment that surrounds us here at the port. To put that in perspective a little bit, and this is where we're going to come back to that 2 million kilograms a day that we've been producing here. Some of the refineries here are actually 100 years old. The port complex here, including both the Port of LA and the Port of San Pedro, has about 20,000 heavy-duty trucks. So 20,000 18-wheelers, as we all say in the U.S. If you could imagine what 20,000 18-wheelers looks like, and imagine that we're on a glide path where we're requiring those to be zero emissions, what would it look like to line up even a quarter of those 5,000 18-wheelers in a row and to try to charge them if we're going with batteries, right? We only have two choices here in the zero emission vehicle game. It's battery electric and fuel cell electric. There are very good applications for batteries, as we're seeing already. I can talk about that maybe a little bit in the Q&A, especially relative to light duty. But in the heavy duty sector, the amount of batteries that you would need to get a kind of a respectable range, so to speak, out of an 18-wheeler would consume about 15% of the overall cargo capacity of those trucks. So somewhere around 12,000 pounds of batteries in order to get maybe a 300-mile range out of a heavy-duty truck. And then when you imagine 5,000 or 10,000 or 20,000 of those trucks lined up trying to charge them, we're taking them out of their duty cycle for 4 hours, 8 hours, 12 hours. This has a huge economic impact. It's really just not going to be possible to convert those trucks using batteries. I think ultimately we'll probably see maybe 20% of those using batteries, but the rest will have to be hydrogen. So I think that's the most scalable use in the transportation sector right now. And then there's some really exciting other uses right here in the port. So believe it or not, the trucks aren't the highest polluters in the port. We have certain cranes, gantry cranes, that cargo handling equipment that are actually heavier polluters than the trucks themselves. There are 3,000 pieces of cargo handling equipment here in the port complex. So 20,000 trucks, 3,000 pieces of cargo handling equipment. In addition to that, we have about 45 or 46 tugboats. So to put all of this into perspective, those 45 or 46 tugboats produce more pollution than all 3,000 pieces of cargo handling equipment here. So we have the ability just to change over. If we look at maybe 140 gantry cranes here in the port complex and 45 or 46 tugboats, converting those over to hydrogen would actually be cleaner than thousands and thousands of other pieces of heavy-duty transportation equipment, and certainly than probably tens of thousands of light-duty vehicles here. So this is where I think the work that EIN does and the work that AltaSea does really comes together so nicely. It's the intersect of the hydrogen economy, the new energy economy, and the ocean economy right here to help clean up port operations. And then when we start to get into maritime applications with ocean-going vessels, which account for 2 to 3% of the overall pollution worldwide, we have an opportunity to clean up literally the dirtiest pieces of equipment in the world right now, and there's nowhere where that's showcased better than the port complex here in Los Angeles. So I'm really excited to be working with AltaSea. I'm really excited that Terry is now the CEO here, because he's got a passion for hydrogen and a passion for the ocean economy, and all I can say is grab onto Terry and hold on with white knuckles, because this guy's going to take us for a wild ride, and there's nobody that can have more of an impact doing this than Terry. So, what I'm going to do is, I'll kind of breeze through industrial decarbonization, which is really kind of the third pillar of end-use applications for hydrogen. So I mentioned that the primary, I actually wanted to finish my point about the 2 million kilograms per day that we're producing statewide. So when I was talking about the gantry equipment, the ocean-going vessels, and the heavy-duty trucks here, I did some back-of-the-envelope math over the last week or so to try to figure out how much hydrogen it would take to convert all of the 20,000 trucks and 3,000 pieces of cargo handling equipment here at the port to run on hydrogen. How much hydrogen would that take? And it's about 3 million kilograms a day. So the thirst for hydrogen at the port here, the impact that we have, is almost 50% higher than the overall amount of hydrogen that we produce statewide. And I say this because I want to point out the economic opportunity, the opportunity to have an amazing environmental impact here, and just the scale of the opportunity to really kind of change the face of the environmental movement through port operations alone is so massive that it's 50% bigger than all of the heavy industry or heavy industrial applications for hydrogen statewide right now. So we could just focus so much work in the hydrogen movement right here within 5 miles of this location and have such a massive impact. It could keep us busy for years. And this is a global movement. Imagine, what we're looking at accomplishing across the United States. We're seeing huge progress in Europe and in Asia right now. I couldn't be more excited about the progress that the hydrogen movement has made over the last 2 years. It's funny, after 20 years of being on the road trying to scream from the hilltops why this is important, it's really had its moment, why we've all been locked at home and kind of locked behind computers. So this is an exciting opportunity, and I'm really excited to be able to actually come out in person, engage with the audience, work with AltaSea, and really talk about, what are some of the next steps and the things that we can accomplish here together. So to kind of round out the end-use applications, I've really explained the role of hydrogen in refining, in ammonia production, in steel, glass, concrete production. These are all heavy industrial activities that either use hydrogen directly, as in the case of refining, or have large heating components where we use natural gas to provide that heat. So we have an opportunity now to use hydrogen as a heating medium instead of fossil fuels. So we can replace natural gas and we can replace fossil hydrogen in the heaviest, dirtiest applications in the world, and actually help decarbonize some of these industries that we know, we need ongoing steel production, we need ongoing concrete production. How can we do that in a cleaner way? And the answer is hydrogen. So that's really the third pillar of these applications, being industrial decarbonization, transportation, and then renewable energy storage. And then sometimes I say there are 3.5 pillars. The other consideration is disaster resilience, and that really draws from each of these three areas of application. But the best way I can sum up the potential there is the fact that these cars are actually generators. These cars produce electricity in real time rather than storing it in batteries. They're electric vehicles. They have electric motors. But again, instead of having a couple thousand pounds of batteries on them, they use this tank of hydrogen to produce electricity in real time, so that the car can move on electricity, right? But if you would rather use that for stationary sources, it's really the same electricity that we're producing. So when Toyota introduced the first generation Mirai, it was really in response to the Fukushima disaster in Japan, and they realized that they needed energy redundancy. They needed the ability when there is an interruption in a conventional source of energy production. We need the ability to really be able to lean on other production methods or other storage methods. So they started putting plugs in the back of each of the Mirai. So if you open the trunk in a Japanese Mirai, there's a cutaway where there's a plug. And that plug can plug into, say, your electric panel in your home. The amazing thing about that, and this was the last generation Mirai, so this Mirai actually holds more fuel and it produces more power than the last generation. The last generation Mirai with full hydrogen tank could keep the average American home electrified for a week, for a full week. So you can pull one of these cars into your garage, close the door because you don't have to worry about the emissions coming out of the vehicle, plug it into your electric panel, and keep your home running. And this is the average American home where we have washers and dryers running, and we have TVs for our dogs, and we have, God knows what else, other electrical devices here. We can keep the average electrical home electrified for a week with old technology at this point. So imagine what we can do with new technology. Imagine the role of all of these hydrogen trucks that I'm talking about for powering disaster response centers, just like this. In the case of an emergency, which is always at the front and center of our minds as Californians. We can take locations just like the AltaSea warehouses here. We can use zero emission backup power from trucks, from forklifts, from light duty vehicles. We can power life-saving medical equipment. We can power cell phone chargers. We can power anything that we need to power in the case of an emergency. So I think disaster resilience is a really fascinating end-use application for hydrogen that really draws on transportation, energy storage, and some of the hydrogen that we might be using for industrial decarbonization here. So I'm really excited about the potential there as well. So, I think I've already talked about these end-use applications. I wanted to just kind of mention how we've gotten here. And again, kind of, you can guess that it's Terry is how we've gotten here, right? So we've had the strongest leadership in the state of California to kind of lay the foundation for the hydrogen movement out of anywhere in the world. California, and really because of Terry's work to launch the California Hydrogen Highway Initiative to prop up SB 32, which is the predecessor to AB 8, which provided funding for us to build these hydrogen stations, for the Global Warming Solutions Act of 2006. These are all of the things that set the table for California to help prop up some of these technologies and industries that really represent the future of clean energy. And it's because of this forward leaning work that Terry did, frankly, 20 years ago. Now the federal government is catching on and starting to allocate billions of dollars instead of millions or tens of millions of dollars to help really push this movement forward. But it really is thanks to the work that Terry and the Schwarzenegger administration did almost 20 years ago to get us to this point. So again, way ahead of the game, and really excited to see what's up next here. So with that, I just kind of wanted to leave. I've got a lot of kind of wonky policy stuff in here, which we can go into, but I wanted to start our Q&A session just with this in the background, because this diagram, I feel like, I'm no artist here, but this diagram really sums up the role of hydrogen as the connector of the power grid, the gas grid, and essentially the liquid fuels sector of the economy. So as you can see, hydrogen is there in the middle. We can use electricity for electrolysis and then send that hydrogen back to the power grid in terms of energy storage. We can send it to the transportation economy through liquid fuels. We can even inject it into the gas pipelines right now to displace fossil fuels really without any noticeable impact on, say, your gas stove at home. We can inject about 20 to 30% hydrogen into the gas pipeline right now to decarbonize appliances we're really already using, all the way up to combined heat and power turbines that we're seeing at power plants around here. So all of these areas are truly interconnected. Each of them can feed each other, and it's hydrogen right there in the middle as the connective tissue that will enable a cleaner transition to the energy future. So in a nutshell, I'll stop boring you with slides and policy wonk talk, and I'm happy to answer some questions. So please let me know. All right.
Can you just talk a little bit about the process of producing the hydrogen and how it might differ for different forms of it? Because I'm a little confused about what form would the batteries, the energy storage take versus the, liquid take versus the injection air, if you could just clarify that a little. Thanks.
So after you produce hydrogen, regardless of the means of production, right, the molecules are the same. So the same hydrogen, whether you're producing it from, let's say, a dirtier means with a fossil fuel feedstock, or from electrolysis or pyrolysis, or reforming biogas, the molecules are the same. So you could put them in these cars, you could put them into the pipeline, you could use them in heavy industrial applications. So it's really trying to switch over from steam methane reform, which is kind of the primary technology we've been using. Essentially, you're putting natural gas or methane into an empty space using very high temperature steam to kind of break the bonds of methane, which is CH4. So, one carbon molecule and two hydrogen molecules, which are H2. And so we're separating those and capturing them, but there's this extra carbon molecule that, when released, combines with ambient oxygen and makes CO2. So what we're trying to do is avoid that process by using means like electrolysis, where instead of the carbon molecule, you've got H2O for water, and so we've got this extra oxygen molecule that is actually, another productive byproduct of that process that we can use elsewhere. With the example of biogas, like dairy biogas or biogas from wastewater treatment plants, again, we're coming back to that CH4 molecule. So there is a carbon byproduct, but what we need to take into account is that we're mitigating these methane emissions, which are actually much more impactful than CO2 emissions. So even with a carbon byproduct, using biogas feedstock to produce hydrogen is ultimately much cleaner than zero, right? So I've seen applications, we measure the impact or kind of the environmental impact of hydrogen through carbon intensity. So a lot of people right now are talking about what I call the hydrogen rainbow, which would be green hydrogen, blue hydrogen, gray hydrogen. They're inventing new colors every day, but at the end of the day, what really matters is the carbon intensity. How clean is that hydrogen, regardless of the production method? So gasoline is somewhere around 150, I think, grams per unit of grams of CO2 per unit of gasoline. If we take hydrogen from electrolysis, from a renewable electricity resource and produce hydrogen, we hit zero, right? So there's zero carbon involved in that process. But if you use biogas from certain resources, so one example, and the most extreme example of this pathway through CARB, is taking dairy biogas, so methane emissions from cows, using that to produce hydrogen and using that hydrogen in a fuel cell. The carbon intensity is actually negative 281. So it's actually, you're literally cleaning up the environment by doing this. And so, I think the trick would be to find still a productive use for that extra bit of carbon, even though we're still cleaner than we would be because of the methane emissions. And there are some really cool things that we can do with that. One of the coolest is just sending that CO2 over to one of the breweries right around the corner to make beer, right? We're seeing some other means of building material production using carbon. So, carbon sequestration isn't, it's not a topic that the environmental community loves to talk about, but ultimately, until we get to this point where carbon is eliminated from the processes where we're producing energy or hydrogen or whatever it may be, we really need to take a look at how we can have a near-term immediate impact, because the place is literally burning around us, right? So we can't hold out for the perfect, and in the meantime, I think that there are some good arguments that can be made for not only carbon capture, but carbon capture and reuse. So sending that to food and beverage or building materials or synthetic fuels, there are all kinds of ways we can handle that. So I hope that helps answer the question. I know that we can get into the weeds with hydrogen production, but at the end of the day, we really just need to focus on carbon intensity and making sure that it's as clean as possible, and that we're using all of the resources that are available to us to do that. So.
I appreciate your continual reference to methane. What's the lead times, of course, near term. But so what concerns me is in the thought of biogas as means to produce, as one of the components of producing it seems that would actually, because of methane slip, we would still be left with methane regardless of how much.
Sure.
I'm suspicious of the biogas, the real actual net reduction in methane. I don't think it.
And understandably so. Sure. So, I'm sorry. So, we're talking about essentially the kind of well-to-wheel impact of using, even methane and repurposing that for, what we might consider a cleaner use than just letting it escape into the atmosphere, and essentially whether biogas is really helpful at the end of the day, or whether there's baggage that comes along with using biogas. So ultimately, this isn't really the end goal for hydrogen as far as using biogas as a feedstock. To put that into perspective, if we convert every potential source of biogas in the state of California, from every dairy farm, from every wastewater treatment plant, every possible source, we could displace about 16% of the current demand for natural gas in the state. So biogas just is not a scalable solution at the end of the day. I think what we need to consider is, what can we do with that while we're getting off of gas right now? So by no means do we want to prolong the use of fossil fuels, even when they're from, natural sources like, cattle, for example. We don't want to prolong that at all, but what we're trying to do is find a near-term glide path where we can use that stuff productively while we're getting off of it. But the end of the day goal is no fossil fuels here, and we don't want to prolong that through the hydrogen movement. So, all right, great. Okay.
So it seems to me, just looking at things from the outside, that kind of at a smaller scale, there's this, it's almost like kind of looked at as this battle between battery electric and hydrogen, and that's almost a bit of a blocker to look at it that way, when in the end of the day, it's already good for light duty and above. I love that you guys are starting there. But then there's this problem where it's how do we get, the people in charge or the people with money or whatever to say it does look like this, right? And in the end of the day, it's a solution that mixes it all together, right? So then from AltaSea's perspective, do you guys, how much of it is we're starting here, we know this is good, and we're just going to show you guys the way, as opposed to how much are you guys working with, federally, locally, whatever else, governments, and that, how do you address that problem? Let's not make ourselves against anything else, and let's get people with this high level perspective where it matters.
That's probably the biggest challenge that our organization faces right now, because there's this perception that we're in a VHS versus Betamax war for what format is going to eventually take over. And the best example I have of that is we literally have two tools in the zero emission toolbox for transportation, right? And that's batteries and hydrogen. So it's like really telling either consumers or the policy community that you can have wind or solar, but you can't have both, right? It's like, why would we eliminate one of only two tools that we possibly have? And at the fundamental level, that's really what we're facing with that question. Now, ultimately, there are kind of PR concerns where, Elon Musk has made a lot of noise with Tesla. He's really done a lot over a very short period of time advancing the case for battery electric vehicles. And he's come out, quite negatively against hydrogen. So we're in this kind of weird period in this country where we don't know what to believe, right? With the news that's coming out, with environmental news, with pandemic news, with there's so much disinformation and just noise out there that it's really hard to sort through it. And so we try to come back to the basics, which is, kind of the two tools in the toolbox analogy, which really helps. But also we have to consider that one of those tools, like batteries, that's not necessarily the end-all solution for everyone, right? So we talked about the limitations of batteries for, let's say, heavy-duty transportation. But when you consider light-duty transportation and the fact that a lot of people believe that we'll move over to 100% battery electric vehicles, like let's just use the state of California as an example, because we have a mandate here that will go 100% ZEV for new car sales by 2035 over the next 12 years. What we do need to consider is that over 50% of people in the state of California live in multifamily housing. They don't necessarily have a garage or a dedicated parking space to be able to plug a vehicle into. There are affordability concerns. There are all sorts of concerns about whether or not there's enough lithium and cobalt to actually make enough batteries to go 100% battery electric vehicles. But at the end of the day, it's really the environmental justice concerns to make sure that everyone has access to this technology and access to a plug, at the end of the day. So I think that's the way that we're right now most effectively getting the attention of the policy community, and really just saying that, hey, we can't just put out a technology that would only apply to wealthy people that live in coastal California. We need a solution that everyone has access to, and hydrogen just provides an alternative in that respect. Even if 80% of the light-duty market ends up being batteries, we've got to still make sure that there's an alternative for people that either need that longer range, the faster refueling time, or just simply don't have access to a plug at home. Yeah.
Right, but that's at the consumer level. So just kind of curious how much we're talking down to like literally the car, since the cars are here.
Sure. So we're following the fast rule of know your audience, right? So certain folks, California agencies or within the policy community want to talk about light-duty transportation. And so we know, hey, we can come in and talk about the fast refueling time, the ability to build SUVs that wouldn't take as many batteries, or access to charging. Other folks want to talk about heavy-duty equipment, and we've got something to talk to them about here at the port. Some people want to talk about how do we store renewable energy or clean up the power plants that we've got. And so it's really a question of trying to put ourselves in the shoes of the audience, figure out, where their information is coming from, and which part of the hydrogen story, which is so vast, going back to Terry's Swiss Army knife analogy, which part of that story really fits with that audience. So, do we have time for any more? Or? Okay.
Thank you, Brian. Brian's not going anywhere. Please come up and talk to him. I think people are getting a little uncomfortable in our very hard seats. I want to thank everybody for coming, and also point out all of our education partners, which Los Angeles Maritime Institute, Cabrillo Marine Aquarium, and Emerald Bay, who sailed in from Catalina to be here. And please visit with Brian's cars here, and you'll stick around, right? Yeah, of course. Right? Be here. And if you all want to stray as far as the next warehouse, we have the USC Seaweed Lab, and we also have Holdfast Aquaculture down there. Thank you.